What does it truly take to transform Congress? Welcome to Future Hindsight, where we take big ideas in civic life and democracy and turn them into action items for you and me. Because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. I'm Mila Atmos. Today, we're speaking with the author of a timely new book about the inner workings of Congress, how it changes, who drives that change, and what gets in the way. We'll explore the role of money, media, and increasingly violence in shaping our politics. And we'll ask the harder questions about power, reform, and what it really means to govern in a democracy. Maya Kornberg is Senior Research Fellow at NYU Law's Brennan Center for Justice and author of Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. And before we start, if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere in between, it really goes a long way for other listeners to discover our show. Welcome, Maya. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have had many conversations about money in politics, and we've also discussed the influence of the media, but we have not yet had an expansive conversation about violence. It's not that violence is new, as you point out in the book, but for sure the threat of violence today is both quantitatively and qualitatively different. Between Nancy Pelosi's husband being attacked in their home, the Minnesota state lawmakers being shot dead in their homes, and January 6th, there's no question that we live in dangerous times. And you start the book, actually, with a death threat to former Representative Eric Swalwell's office. Why did you start there?
So I started, as you're mentioning, with actually a slew of death threats that were called in to former Representative Eric Swalwell's office, because I think that it is just an example of something that has become, unfortunately, all too normalized in American politics. When I speak to representatives, as I did for the book, and we also know this from data from the U.S. Capitol Police and other sources, the number of times that they're getting people calling in death threats, threatening them, threatening increasingly, unfortunately, their children, their spouses, their families, is just really shockingly high. And so one of the themes, as you're mentioning, that the book talks about is not just the incidence of violence, but how that's distorting lawmaking. What are the ramifications for our democracy of the fact that what happened to Eric Swalwell at the beginning of the book has just become all too frequent in American politics? And you listed a few incidents of actual physical violence, but for every incidence of physical violence, there are so many more instances of threats and harassments and insults that have become, unfortunately, all too frequent for politicians at all levels of government.
Right. And it's not only Democrats who get
100%.
targeted. Even we recently had a conversation about how Senator Murkowski said basically that people are scared, Republicans are scared because of threats from the right.
Definitely. It's a very bipartisan topic. And according to data from the U.S. Capitol Police, members from both parties are receiving alarmingly high numbers of threats and incidents of violence. Between 2018 and 2023, according to data from the U.S. Capitol Police, the number of threats of violence and incidents of violence against members doubled. And then it's continued to rise since then. And in the book, there are quotes from folks like Liz Cheney saying that there are members who came to her and said, "I would have voted to impeach the president, but I was afraid for the safety of myself and my family." We know that there have been countless attacks on folks like Adam Kinzinger or Liz Cheney, who are on the January 6th committee. So there's a lot of violence and threats, both from members of their own party in some instances and people across the ideological spectrum. So again, it's definitely not isolated, not to one party, not to one demographic group increasingly. It's really an epidemic that we have to reckon with, just as Americans, as citizens, and as people who want functional politics.
Well, it's definitely difficult to have functional politics when you're getting death threats and your family is being threatened and you cannot vote on bills
Right.
that you think are the right bills to vote for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So my book talks about 3 ways in which this violence is distorting politics. You mentioned Nancy Pelosi's husband. The book actually quotes Nancy Pelosi's memoir, where she says that when she speaks to young dynamic people thinking of running for Congress, what they tell her is that what happened to Paul Pelosi, the violent attack on her husband in their San Francisco home, that's their greatest fear. That's the reason that they're not running for Congress. I interviewed Angie Craig, who was a representative who was assaulted in her building in 2023. She also told me that she thinks violence is the biggest deterrent to getting people into politics. So the attrition problem, I think, is something that we have to reckon with. And that's not just in Congress. My colleagues and I at the Brennan Center did a study a few years ago where we looked at violence faced by local office holders. It was a survey of all 50 states, different kinds of state and local office holders. Among local office holders, women in local office, about 50% of them said that they were dissuaded from running for re-election or running for higher office because of violence. So we have to think about the attrition problem and particularly the disparate impact on women, on people of color, on young people, on people who we know violence has a disparate impact on. So we have to think about what does it mean to be in a democracy where members can't vote their conscience?
Yes.
Or members can't vote to impeach the president if they want to because they're afraid for the safety of their families, that they would shy away from hot-button issues because they were afraid of violence. So that is something that is distortive to democracy in general. And then the last thing that I'll mention is that members are constricting civic engagement, which is another core tenet of a functional democracy. So one member told me, I'm afraid to go to certain parts of my own district because I'm afraid for my safety or the safety of my staff, especially since for this member, she said most of her district staff were women.
Right.
Other
but
members,
notably, for example, Gabby Giffords was shot basically
That's exactly
at a meet
what I
and
was-
greet with her
yeah.
constituents.
And that's exactly what I was going to say. One member, Representative Scanlon, told me, how could I not have the 2011 shooting of Gabby Giffords at a Congress at Your Corner event in the back of my mind?
Mm-hmm.
How can we not have that in the back of our mind when we do a Congress at Your Corner event? So,
Yes.
we're seeing members cancel town halls, cancel engagement events. We saw Ilhan Omar, Representative Ilhan Omar, recently attacked at a town hall.
Yes.
And I view democracy as a continuous conversation between representatives and their constituents. And that conversation is being constricted and diluted by this violence.
Right. Well, I want to pivot here a little bit to the way that you have organized your book around 3 change-making classes: the Watergate babies of 1974, the Contract with America in 1994 under the leadership of Newt Gingrich, and the Blue Wave class of 2018, which came about after the 2016 election of President Trump. And I want to delve deeper on each. But broadly speaking, what do these 3 classes share in common?
So I wanted to write a book that spoke to how we got here, right? The title Stuck speaks to what a lot of us are feeling about our democracy in general and certainly about Congress, which is that it is stuck, that in so many ways it is not delivering in the way that it was intended to do, not delivering for ordinary Americans. And so it is an attempt to look backward in order to chart a course forward. It looks back 50 years in order to explain how we got here. And I firmly believe that you need to understand how we got here in order to understand how we can move forward.
Totally agree.
And so it's a book about change-making. And in writing a book about change-making, I wanted to look at the times that Congress is the most changeable. And as a congressional scholar, I think that that's when there's waves of new people coming to Congress. And so these 3 moments in time, the class of 1974, the class of 1994, and the class of 2018, are 3 of the largest groups of new members who've come to the House of Representatives over the past 50 years. And so I wanted to anchor the book in these wave elections, these moments of change for the institution to see what we can learn. And the other thing that these 3 classes have in common that I think is really important right now and why I chose them is that they speak to Congress's relationship with the executive. They're inflection points in terms of Congress's relationship with the executive branch. All 3 of these classes are tied to impeachment proceedings in different ways. And given the rampant executive abuse of power and the ways in which we're seeing a Congress that is supine right now, a Congress that needs to understand how to stand up to the president, I wanted to understand, again, how these moments in time, these key inflection points in Congress's relationship with the president can help us understand how Congress can strengthen itself vis-a-vis the executive once again.
Yeah, definitely. We have also had multiple conversations on the podcast. We were like, when is Congress going to step up and be the real co-governing branch alongside the executive?
Right.
But let's take a closer look at the Watergate babies of 1974. They really came in to shake things up, including being elected in such substantial numbers that made congressional reform that started before they actually were elected actually stick. So what is, in your mind, the most significant institutional reform that they accomplished for the American people?
So this class comes in, as you're saying, over 90 new members swept into Congress on change campaigns. The backdrop is the increasingly unpopular Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, a real frustration with a government that feels stuck, that is not delivering in the 1970s. And this class, I would say that their most substantial change, the one that's had the most ripple effects, is that they actually came in and they changed the way that power is allocated within the chamber. They came in, and because there were over 90 new members, they were such a substantial proportion of the Democratic caucus at the time. They were able to change the way that committee assignments were made. They took it from what's called the Ways and Means Committee to the Party Steering Committee. They were able to change the way in which committee leadership decisions were made. They were successful in what Henry Waxman called toppling old lions. Henry Waxman was a member from that class, toppling these deeply entrenched committee leaders. And taken together, all these changes that they made it easier for new members to come in and actually gain legislative power much more quickly than they would have been able to before. A lot of members of this class rose to committee leadership positions more quickly than one would normally be able to get leadership positions. And that meant that they actually were able to push forward more of the kind of legislative reform agenda that they were elected to push forward than they would otherwise be able to. And that system that they created, the way in which they took power away from deeply entrenched committee leaders, the way in which they made it easier for people to rise up more quickly, that was very monumental in terms of changing Congress, the House in particular, as an institution.
So after the chapter of the class of 1974, you actually dedicate a chapter to building and reshaping power, and where you also mention how the committees are reworked and how freshmen can have power in the way that they didn't before. And in the first section of that chapter of building and reshaping power is a section on the Buckley versus Valeo decision in 1976. So until I read your book, I didn't know that it was decided in the context of campaign finance reform in Congress. Tell us about how this decision changed elections and, one could argue, paved the way for Citizens United.
So the 1976 Buckley v. Valeo Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court rules that spending limits are unconstitutional in campaigns. And the ripple effect of that is that money starts flooding campaigns. And this is accelerated by Citizens United in 2010 when the Supreme Court rules that there can be unlimited outside spending in campaigns. But really, I think 1976 is the beginning of what we're seeing, which is this dramatic change in the landscape of money and politics in the United States in the last 50 years. A lot of us, I think people who read the newspaper, read a lot of headlines about the way in which all these campaigns are breaking campaign fundraising records. Even right now, money floods all of these campaigns, and you need to raise a lot of money to get elected. What I think people don't often realize is the way in which this decision, Buckley v. Valeo, and then again it's accelerated in 2010, reshaped the way that pathways to power are built in Congress. So I'll give one example of how one change can reshape the system. 1976, there's the Buckley v. Valeo decision. Shortly thereafter, the chairman of a committee is going to retire. Henry Waxman, who, as I mentioned, was just elected in 1974, he sees this as an opportunity. He wants to get a committee leadership position. He was just elected a few years earlier. And he represents a safe and wealthy district of Beverly Hills. Now, at the time, he knows that from his campaign committee, he can only donate so much to other members. But he starts what's called a leadership PAC. A leadership PAC allows him to donate more money to other members in the chamber in order to curry favor and campaign to get that committee leadership position because he needs their votes. He ends up winning that committee leadership position. And fast forward 50 years, almost every member of the House of Representatives has a leadership PAC. And now it's just commonplace to donate money to other members in order to curry favor, in order to build relationships. Fast forward 50 years, you're supposed to pay dues now to the party, sometimes of millions of dollars, if you want to get onto that, A-list committee that you want to get onto. If you want to get a party leadership position, you have to pay to play in the chamber in a way that is completely distortive to power structures. And in addition to just being distortive in and of itself, is also reproducing structural disadvantages in fundraising that are faced by groups with less access to wealth. So there's an example of Marcia Fudge telling a staffer, Representative Marcia Fudge, that she doesn't know how she's going to leverage the working class community that she represents in the Cleveland area in order to pay her dues to the party. Which I find shocking. I think we should all find shocking.
Yes, it is shocking. Well, I think what's really shocking about it, I'm somebody who's pretty well informed at this point. I didn't understand that you were paying each other off until I read your book, which sounds totally bananas, honestly. But because, because when we think about Buckley v. Vallejo, we think that it's really outside money that is spending on elections, or especially Citizens United. But I didn't understand that there was such a thing as a leadership PAC where you can pay each other off, within the party or maybe even across the aisle to make sure that you can get those good committee seats and maybe even chairmanships.
Right.
But let's turn to the conservatives under Newt Gingrich with a contract with America in 1994. This was also a class of representatives that was elected in response to frustration with the man in the White House, President Clinton. 73 new Republicans were elected, of which 65 were previously held by Democrats. So for the listener who may not be familiar with the contract with America, what exactly is it and what was the goal?
So the contract with America was the kind of key campaign document in the 1994 elections. This was a change document. Again, this is another kind of wave election that is elected on promises of change. And it lists policy priorities, both kind of key Republican policy priorities like balancing the budget, but also process reforms like term limiting committee chairs. And it's their vision for change if they are elected. It was a printout, little document. There's a lot of photos during the campaign of them holding it up. And I think it speaks to the power of having this kind of cohesive vision for reform that you lay out, a few steps that you can take. I think that's a very effective campaign strategy. And we saw it be effective in 94. Other campaigns have employed that strategy more recently as well.
Yeah, it's the Project 2025 of 1994.
Yes.
Essentially. But the vision that they had is not really what came to pass. And one of the things that was most notable to me in the book, which I didn't know about, was that one of the reforms was to defund the Office of Technology Assessment, OTA. And I'm quoting your book now. It is a support agency that operated between 1974 and 1995 and helped Congress understand science and technology. And of course, the repercussions are still felt today because it did at that time for 21 years provide essential scientific and technological assessment and advice to Congress so that members of Congress can make informed decisions on bills that are science related. So much about the anti-science tendencies in Congress actually make more sense now that I know that this is no longer operating. So, but in your mind, how would you characterize the lasting legacy of the 104th Congress of 1994 on the institution, on Congress as a whole?
Right. So they come to Congress, and first of all, I think that part of the reason that so much of the contract with America does not end up becoming lasting change is because, as political scientist Richard Fenno, who I quote in the book, says, they are long on size and cohesion, this class, but short on governing experience. So they're coming in after 40 years of uninterrupted Democratic control of the House, and there's a lot of chaos that ensues. But if I were to wrap up up what this class and what Newt Gingrich in particular as the speaker, as the party leader at the time did, I would quote one journalist at the time who said that Congress self-lobotomized itself. That's what happened in the 90s. That's what happened with the 104th Congress. It led to not only a defunding, as you're mentioning, of a key congressional support agency that helped Congress understand science. And again, the ripple effect, if you look at what's happening now, is that there's quotes in my book from staff saying, we're Googling complex policy questions. We just don't have access, which is terrifying to think that they're having to resort to Googling complex policy issues. But he also, Newt Gingrich at the time, completely gutted committee staff, which is another source of expertise for Congress. He reduced funding dramatically to other key congressional support agencies like the Congressional Research Service and others. And so the reality right now is that Congress today has several thousand fewer staff members than it did a few decades ago. And when we think about why Congress can't stand up to the executive, I think it's important to think about it in that context. Mm-hmm. Congress needs independent expertise. It needs independent brain power in order to conduct effective oversight. And it just doesn't have that anymore.
Right, right. You know, it's interesting for me to learn all of this history because I didn't really know how much funding was cut, really, in the 90s, and we're definitely living the repercussions today. Like you said, people are in Congress Googling things, and soon they're going to use ChatGPT, or probably they're using it already, and they're getting hallucinations as opposed to truth.
Yes.
So I want to now pivot to the class of 2018, which was, of course, a huge blue wave in response to the Trump election in 2016. It is the largest freshman class since 1974. And 2018, of course, is now 8 years ago. And Trump is back in office. And some of the representatives that were elected in 2018 are now senators. And while 8 years seems like a long time, in congressional time, it's not that long, right? So many members serve a very long time. Some, of course, would argue that we need term limits. You know, for example, Nancy Pelosi is still in office. This is not a knock on Nancy Pelosi, but just why are people in Congress for so long? But that's another question. What I really want to know in this moment, what would you consider the lasting and most impactful change by the class of 2018?
So the class of 2018 comes in, yet again, a change-making class that is swept in because of frustration. At the time, the kind of aftermath of Trump's first election in 2016, they are, as Politico describes them, younger, bluer, and more diverse than ever. So one of the things that they bring to Congress is a richness of lived experience that shapes policy making in different ways, whether that's Lauren Underwood coming to Congress as a young Black woman, a nurse, and teaming up with Alma Adams to start the Black Maternal Health Caucus, or whether that's Tom Malinowski bringing his experience in the State Department in terms of foreign policy expertise and foreign affairs policy in Congress. So there's so many different experiences that they bring. And one of the things that they do when they get there is they understand their collective power. Actually, they do this even before they get there. Over 100 candidates in that class write to Congress. And they say, we want the first bill that Congress takes up to be a democratic reform bill, to be a bill that takes on campaign finance reform and voting rights and other key democracy issues, which ends up being H.R. 1. Freshmen in this class end up being given ownership over key parts of that bill. And it kind of speaks to this cohesive vision for reform and the collective power that a big group of new members can have. And that's important because Congress today, and this is one of the things that the book talks about, is an institution that because of the changes in the 70s and the 90s, power has become so centralized in party leadership that it is increasingly hard for new members when they're elected to actually influence legislation. Right now, instead of the Schoolhouse Rock version of how a bill becomes a law, so often it's party leaders writing a bill with a few lobbyists helping them, pushing it down very quickly for a vote. Sometimes members have said they don't even have time to read a bill before it's voted on. So I think pushing for some kind of power for new members is something that they successfully did. And actually in 2019, right after they come to Congress, Nancy Pelosi starts, and I think this is because this was a large, huge group of freshmen, she starts the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which is the first time in 30 years that Congress has an introspection. You know, they look at things like how congressional process can work more effectively. But the point is that they, yet again, were pushing for changes in how the institution works and functions in a way that I would argue wave elections can do most successfully.
We'll be back with Maya in just a moment, so stick around. You have to hear this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, starting something new is hard. In fact, it can be terrifying. So much work goes into this thing that you're not entirely sure will even work out. And it can be tough to make that leap of faith. Trust me, I know. When I started Future Hindsight, I didn't really know what I was doing. And those questions swirled around. What if no one listens? What if I make a fool of myself? I knew I had a mission, but those thoughts linger whether you want them to or not. But now, I know that I was right in believing in myself, despite any fears or hesitations. Of course, it can also help when you have a partner like Shopify on your side. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Gymshark to fresh brands that are just getting started. And Shopify is there for you too. Accelerate your efficiency, whether you're uploading new products or trying to improve existing ones. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. Now, you might be wondering, what if people haven't heard about my product? What if people haven't heard about my brand? It's okay. Shopify helps you find your customers with easy-to-run email and social media campaigns. So tackle all those important tasks in one place, from inventory to payments to analytics and more. No need to save multiple websites or try to figure out what platform is hosting the tool that you need. Everything is all in one spot, making your life easier and your business operations smoother. What I love about Shopify is how no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. It's time to turn those what-ifs into cha-ching with Shopify today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. That's shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Maya Kornberg. Well, so we have this idea that if we vote in a whole slew of new people, that things are going to, quote, change automatically.
Right.
We know, of course, that's not really accurate, but it is even more complicated than that. You mentioned seniority, you mentioned committee assignments, and how these are really difficult to secure and therefore influence policy outcomes. Tell us a little bit more about how this works. You touched on this briefly, but exactly, if you're a new member, you're a freshman member, how can you get on a committee?
So you're a new member. You've just been elected to Congress. What I would advise you to do is to learn from, for example, folks like Andy Kim or Lauren Underwood that I interviewed for the class of 2018 chapter, or folks in previous classes. What they did was they immediately set up meetings with all the senior members. They understood that the way that you get onto a committee is by building relationships. That was true in 1974 when Henry Waxman used his relationship with Phil Burton in order to get onto a committee, and that's true in 2026, and it will be true in 2027. The House right now in particular is an extremely hierarchical institution, and as a new member, I think that your success depends on your relationship with more senior members, and a lot of it is internal campaigning. The committee that makes committee assignment decisions, the party steering committees on each side, the Republican and Democratic side, they're very opaque. We don't know about their process. I think they should be more transparent. But what we do know is that these relationships matter. The other thing that we know is that Congress offers, and this is one of the things that my book argues should change, Congress offers very little institutional onboarding and help. Former Representative Ed Blumenauer would hand-deliver letters to every new member with his advice because he'd been in Congress for a while. But we shouldn't be relying on a member to hand-deliver you a letter. When you team up and get a mentor, a more senior member, that can also help you learn how to legislate because, unfortunately, Congress does not offer as much as it should in terms of real onboarding and real education in how to legislate for new members.
Yeah, that would be really good. I mean, it sounds like a no-brainer.
It should be.
But this is not obvious nonetheless for the people who are serving in Congress. So we are in a time similar to the incoming class of 1974, which was elected in part as a response to the Vietnam War, to the arrogation of power by the executive, of Nixon resigning in August of that year. Mm-hmm. There are calls from many corners of this country, as I mentioned, for Congress to step up and reclaim its place as a co-equal branch of government alongside the executive. And if members had the appetite to actually do that, to step up, which it currently doesn't, clearly, under the leadership of Speaker Johnson, where should it start?
So a number of things I think would help Congress to stand up to the executive. Firstly, I mentioned that Congress self-lobotomized itself in the 90s.
Yes.
Again, we know from legislative studies in general that legislatures and legislators need independent expertise. They need independent information if they're going to actually be able to conduct oversight of an executive branch as they are meant to do. And so dramatically increasing staffing, that includes nonpartisan staff, and agency staff. That also includes lifting the cap on personal staff that members can hire. They've had the same cap on personal staff that they can hire since 1975.
Oh, wow.
So they're only allowed to hire up to 18 staff members. That includes their district staff and their policy staff in Congress.
And how many do they actually need, you think?
Well, the issue isn't how much they need. The other issue is they also don't have very large budgets.
Right.
And so actually most of them don't end up hiring 18 staff. But I think we need to increase their budget and increase their staffing. And I think that they would need more than 18 staff. That includes, their constituent services, their policy experts. They're representing nearly 1 million people. So if you want them to be able to both respond to constituent requests and understand how to legislate on AI, you need brain power behind that. You need desperately Congress to not just increase its staffing, but retool itself to meet the moment. It hasn't reorganized its committee jurisdictions since the 70s, again. So when we think about an issue like AI, Congress doesn't have a tech committee to deal with it because it hasn't reorganized committees since the internet existed.
I see.
So, this is not just specific to the executive. This is how Congress can stand up as a branch. The other thing that Congress needs to do when it comes to standing up to the executive in particular, in addition to just resourcing itself, making sure it has the tools and the organizations that it needs, is to understand where there are opportunities to build bipartisan support and to stand up together. When we look at congressional history, moments when Congress is changeable tend to be moments where there's more new people in Congress. Moments where Congress stands up to the executive tend to be after the president has overstepped. And that's when Congress gets its, house in order. So if you look at, for example, the 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act, that was after World War II, after Congress thought that the president overstepped in World War II. If we look at what happened in the 1970s with the 1974 Impoundment Control Act, with the 1973 War Powers Resolution, that was after Nixon impounded $50 billion, which is to say that he refused to spend congressionally authorized money, after he overstepped in the Vietnam War in terms of presidential power. We're at a moment where Congress could do that. And historically, when we look at things like war powers and we look at movements around, for example, the repeal of the authorization of the use of military force bill, which was something passed after 9/11, which gave George Bush even more war powers. That was pretty bipartisan. So I think looking for, even in this hyperpolarized space, there are moments like this, especially with the conflict in Iran, spaces where Congress can band together to stand up against the executive. And I think war powers could be one of them. And I certainly think power of the purse is another. That's really important, I think, to think about, because historically there's some urgency for it to stand up when the president has overstepped. And there can be some space for bipartisan cooperation when it comes to congressional power. So looking for opportunities to do that and leaning into it, I think, is really important.
Well, I think at this point it looks only likely if there is a wave election this year in 2026 and that Republicans will lose the majority in Congress. But I don't know if that's really going to happen. I feel like it looks very likely, but I don't know. I feel like it's so difficult actually to predict because so many things can happen between now and then.
Yeah.
The White House is so erratic. And who knows what is going to happen with the war in Iran? We think that it's going to stay isolated, but if it becomes something much larger, I think we're looking at a very different kind of election than we are thinking about in this moment.
What we know about elections is that things can change very quickly. So as you're saying, it's impossible to foresee what will happen. A lot of people that I know are focused a lot on the election, getting people elected and then thinking that when they are elected and we believe in their vision, whatever that might be, that then things will magically change. We need to start thinking about the day after the election. We need to start thinking about how we can fix Congress as an institution and make sure that it has the resources and the tools that it needs as an institution. Because right now, the reality is if you elect someone and, they're in a really hierarchical system, where, as I mentioned, party leaders are just writing legislation. They're in a system in which they have to spend all day dialing for dollars instead of legislating. And they're in a system where they're afraid to vote their conscience because of fear of violence. Then that's not a system in which they can make change even if we elect them.
Yes.
So I think that that's something for us to reckon with, regardless of the fact that we can't really know yet what will happen with the election. What we do know is that these problems that I'm talking about, unfortunately, are probably not going to go away by November.
Definitely not. I mean, some of these problems are so entrenched for decades. So we are clearly not in a direct democracy where everyone votes on the bills directly. We elect representatives, members of Congress, senators to represent us, and we hope that the person we elect really will come close to the way we would vote ourselves. And in the process of writing this book, how has your thinking evolved around our system of democracy?
That's a great question. I've dedicated my entire career to making democracy work better for the people that it's meant to serve. And I think that our democracy works best when it is as engaged as possible with the voices of ordinary Americans. I was committed to all sorts of civic engagement innovations before, but I think writing this book made me even more committed to them. We need to be pushing for a representative democracy where members can actually engage with constituents. One of the things that I think we need to change structurally, among many things, is that when Congress was first created, members represented 30,000 constituents. That's a different kind of representative democracy than when you represent nearly 1 million constituents. So I still believe in representative democracy as a system that works, but we need to actually make sure that our representatives can represent their constituents. That's far too many people to be representing. We need to expand the House. The other thing that I am more committed to than ever is ending Citizens United and getting the horrible influences of big money in politics out of politics. That is tremendously distortive. And one of the things that the book speaks to is the fact that this, hasn't always been the case. Just 50 years ago, things were dramatically different. And so again, we want a representative democracy that works. That's a representative democracy in which all American voices need to be heard. And we have a system right now when you are reliant on a handful of donors. And when you are dialing for dollars all day long instead of legislating, you can't represent your constituents in the way true representative democracy is supposed to work. So representative democracy, I think, is something we should be working towards, but it's not working right now in the way that the framers intended it to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people do talk about expanding Congress, but I think nobody takes that seriously. Why is that, you think?
I think that one of the things that makes it difficult to make big changes like that, even though I've, heard many conversations about them, is that things are so sticky. Things are so deeply entrenched.
Yes.
That's true of the Electoral College. That's true of the size of the House. That's true of other things. And so one of the reasons that I'm so excited about wave elections is that we know that with something like Congress and American politics are at large, it sometimes takes something dramatic to shake things up. So these conversations, I think, are important in laying the groundwork for it. But sometimes something dramatic has to happen, and a huge wave of new people coming in, that's one example of something dramatic coming in and changing things. But in the absence of something dramatic happening, I think we have to just continue to push for these reforms. I think many times reforms seem out of reach until they happen.
Right.
And the day-to-day grind of laying the groundwork, of building the coalitions, of thinking through what works, that lays the groundwork so that when there's a moment, you can seize it.
So we touched on this very briefly earlier. How do you feel about term limits or age limits? I mean, that sounds wrong. That sounds ageist. But what are your thoughts?
So one of the things that we know about Congress is what term limits have done in the Republican context with committee chairs. So I'll give that example. In 1994, one of the changes that is made is actually that the Republicans start term limiting committee chairs in their caucus. And that allows people to rise up more quickly. And, more open seats for chairs allows more new people to gain power. And that's the great thing about term limits. But it also means that they lose the institutional expertise. And sometimes the staffing turns over completely when there's a new chair, because a chair and a ranking member, they get to hire their staff. And so if we want term limits to work, we need to make sure that they're going to work in the context of not losing the expertise that we have in Congress. I actually think that the gerontocracy problem, which you're hinting at, which is clearly a problem when we have an average age in the House in the 50s and an average age in the Senate in the 60s, that problem is not going to be solved with term limits. That problem is going to be solved with campaign finance reform. That problem is going to be solved with making it easier for people to run for office, to win seats. It is so difficult to raise the amounts of money and be in the right networks and deal with the party apparatus that exists right now, that it is just a huge obstacle to people without access to wealth in this country. So that's one thing. And I think that another change that would matter, as you're saying, is potentially instituting age limits. We've had recent examples of members serving from retirement facilities with dementia. That's also not a representative democracy that is working.
Yes.
But I would point out that the average member of Congress right now serves about 4 or so terms. The kind of people who are like Henry Waxman there for 4 decades, or like Nancy Pelosi, that's not actually the problem for most members of Congress. What we have right now is a situation in which it's so hard to get elected. You need so much wealth to get elected that's making it harder for young people, women, people of color, working Americans, others with less access to wealth to run. We have a system where Congress hasn't gotten a raise in 15 years, which again makes it harder for people without access to independent wealth to run. And we have a system in which it's hard to get someone out when they're there because of incumbency advantage and other things. And obviously that creates an incentive for some people to stay for a very long time. The larger issue is still an issue where it's really hard to break in and it's really hard to make change when you get there. And again, I don't think term limits are necessarily going to solve that. I think getting money out of politics is going to solve that. And sure, I don't think we should have people in their 80s with dementia serving from a retirement facility, but I don't think that that's the majority of instances.
That's definitely not the majority of instances. And I like that you're saying it's really campaign finance reform that's going to solve this. I hadn't considered that together. But you do mention several times in the book that in the 70s, it cost something like $40,000 to run. And today that is magnitudes more.
Yes. There's an example in the book of Elizabeth Holtzman, former congresswoman from New York City. She was running against an incumbent in the early 70s, and she said that she was told she needs to raise $100,000 to run. She was only able to raise about $30,000, and she won. Now, even when we take into account inflation, thinking that you would have to raise, the equivalent today of $30,000 to run against an incumbent for Congress is unfortunately something that is unfathomable.
Yes.
So
yes, totally.
That needs to change if we want more cycling out of incumbents like we had with Elizabeth Holtzman.
Yes. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take ourselves to be more empowered and ignite collective change. And we just talked really about people who are serving in Congress, but what's a good way to turn the insights that you share with us into action?
So at a time when Congress is tremendously unpopular as an institution, and when we know from polls that people are disengaging from democracy as a system, and certainly from many of our democratic institutions in the United States, I think it is more important than ever to engage. Obviously, I wrote a book called Stuck, so I'm not arguing that everything is working. But if we want to unstick things, we need to engage with Congress. We can't just be bemoaning its ineptitude. We need to be showing up at the town halls. We need to be showing up at the field hearings and at the committee hearings. We need to be calling our congressperson and telling them, that we want campaign finance reform, telling them that we are speaking out against political violence, telling them that we are against the SAVE Act, which would have been a horrible anti-democratic bill, and everything else that we want Congress to do. That's what Americans, I would urge them to do. And I think that is a representative democracy that functions. There is a four-alarm fire, I think, for our democracy. And part of that four-alarm fire is the lack of trust in our democratic institutions. And there is good reason for Americans to feel that their democratic institutions are not delivering for them. But the key to fixing it is not to pull away. The key to fixing it is to get out there and engage and share what matters to us and fight for things to change, whether that's canvassing for a candidate that you care about or, equally importantly, getting out there and when they're elected, telling them what it is that you want them to change.
Well said. Last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
One of my core beliefs about Congress, and I think that this is true of other institutions, halls of power in the United States, is that it is always changeable, is that it is shaped and reshaped by the people who walk its halls, by the people who work there, and by the people who we elect to govern. And my book speaks to this, kind of shows how much it's changed even in the last 50 years. And so that makes me hopeful. We're sitting here, as we've said a few times now, in the midst of a midterm election. And there is another opportunity to reshape things, to change things. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope. And that keeps me going because there's a lot of work to do to change things. But I truly believe that Congress is very malleable and that we can change things and get things back on track just like we've done before, just like folks did in the 1974 class. We can do that again.
Yeah, hear, hear. Maya, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show. This was a terrific conversation. Thank you for joining me on Future Hindsight.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Maya Kornberg is Senior Research Fellow at NYU Law's Brennan Center for Justice and author of Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Congress is incredibly unpopular, we know this, but don't let that stop you from being engaged. If anything, let it propel you into deeper engagement. Call your representatives, show up, and make your voice heard. The key to fixing the problem is to share what matters to you and to actually fight for things to change. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Catherine Wilkinson. She's the host of the podcast A Matter of Degrees and the author of Climate Wayfinding: Healing Ourselves and the Planet We Call Home.
You don't have to be a climate expert. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't need any PowerPoints with charts and graphs. You just need to be a human who is awake and noticing what's happening and cares and wants things to be different. And I think if we can keep telling the truth, making noise, that is perhaps the most critical lever for change at this point.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. Oh, and while you're there, please leave us a review. It really goes a long way for other listeners to find our show. And if you're listening on your browser, you can find Future Hindsight on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcast app. We are here to build your civic action toolkit every week, so follow Future Hindsight now and we'll come right to you. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work we do as an independent pro-democracy podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Head to youtube.com/futurehindsight now. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.